Good morning, everybody, or maybe to some people, good evening or good afternoon. I know there are some people joining even from Thailand. It's my pleasure to be here. Welcome, everybody. My name is Mateusz. That's a Polish name. I've been part of the Polyglot community for 9 years, I think, since the infamous Polyglot conference in Novi Sad in Serbia. I'm a lifelong language learner, linguist and software engineers. I have background in computational linguistics and computer science. And I'm also co-founder of Talhammer, a language learning application for polyglots and for everybody who wants to learn a language the right way. I started learning languages back in 1991 in post-communist Poland when I was just 13 years old. It was a very interesting period in Polish history in terms of language learning, because essentially overnight, Polish people abandoned learning Russian and embarked on their great journey with the English and the German language. Many Russian teachers had to change careers in that time. I picked up German and English in my teens, followed by Dutch and Italian in my 30s. In my 20s, I was studying, so I was busy doing other things. And then Indonesian in my 40s. Now, some folks think I must have some special language talent, but the truth is, it was a real struggle for me. I had a stutter as a kid, so speaking my own language was a challenge for me. And speaking a foreign language sounded like a very bad joke back then. And I know I'm not the only one. In this talk, we will claim that language learning isn't about being born with a talent. It's not something we can really learn like we do, for example, with history. Rather, it's something that we must train over a longer period of time, like a sports discipline. And like in any sport, two things determine your success or failure: motivation and a good training system. So let's chat about the real question here. Why must language learning be difficult? Stick around for the next 35 minutes to understand why embracing difficulty and not simplicity is key to long-term success in language learning. So how come we are calling language learning difficult if children pick it up with such ease? And what's really fascinating for us at Talhammer specifically is that children learn not only individual words, but how to combine those words into sentences. So how come as children, we manage to understand the logic that governs building sentences, despite the fact that we could not understand much about the world around us, and in such a way that the other person can decode our message according to the agreed code? Is this ability a proof of some magical subconscious process that is unavailable to adults? Or maybe it is proof that the way we learn languages as adults is just dramatically inefficient. In this talk, we claim exactly this. We learn the wrong things in the wrong way. But let's start from the beginning. Many language learners would like to know if we can repeat the same process to learn our second, third, or even nth language. And it seems we cannot, but we can surely create a process that is very effective, at least in some areas. It also seems that we might have a special tool that we can use, so-called formulaic sequences or formulaic language. I will talk about this later. But the main reason why we cannot repeat the same process is that essentially childhood is one big language lesson. Children operate with a completely different consciousness and under completely different conditions. Basically, everything differs: the amount of time, biology, consciousness. Look at the development of the brains and specifically the speech muscles like tongue, lips, and vocal cords, which are evolving hand in hand with the language around. And by that, they get tuned to its structure and sounds. That's why it's so difficult to get rid of a foreign accent. The movements of the muscles must be very precise to sound native-like. And these precise movements develop very early. And what is even more interesting is that native language seems to be integrated with the areas of the brain responsible for sensory motor skills like seeing, hearing, or touching. Look, and that would explain why we move our hands automatically when we speak, and why access to our native language is very fast and speaking is so effortless, essentially just like moving our hands. This integration can be proved with a very simple experiment. The original plan was to do this experiment here, but we don't have time. But if you are interested, look up, I'm not going to tell you this now because you're going to look up now. I'm going to tell you at the end what the name of the experiment is. For now, you'll just have to believe me. I'm going to come back to that. But all of the above does not mean that adults cannot learn language fluently. We have to do it a little bit differently, though. And there are a few things that work in favor of adults, especially our short-term memory and our declarative memory, our logical thinking. At high level, two systems are at our disposal. One is super fast and very short, and we call it short-term memory or working memory. Using IT terminology, it can be compared to RAM. Here we paid for the ultra-fast storage with a very small capacity, usually 5 to 10 elements. It is the memory that you would use if I ask you to recite a given list of numbers in reverse order. You can feel that this memory operates very fast. You could probably do it easily with 5, 8 elements, but not so easily with 20 elements because it's very small. The other type of memory is the so-called long-term memory. You can compare it to your hard disk if you have a big hard disk. Long-term memory seems to be virtually unlimited in capacity at the price of slow writing, which usually requires many attempts. But what is crucial for our discussion, and pay attention here because it's very important, is the specialization of long-term memory into declarative part and non-declarative part, also called procedural memory. So the declarative part, we use it for declaring things in a conscious way, like dates, tasks, methods. Here are the things you know, and you can tell them to others. So if I ask you what year you were born, you can just tell me this. The procedural memory, on the other hand, is subconscious, and you use it when you act instinctively, like riding a bike or fearing a spider. It's a good example. So here are things you know and you can show by doing. So if I ask you if you can play piano, you need to play the piano to really prove it. So now comes the $1 million question. Where is language located? Is it the declarative part or is it the non-declarative part? Growing evidence suggests that language depends largely, if not completely, on non-declarative memory, exactly like other sensory motor complex skills, like playing football or piano. Given that, and given that language is integrated with other sensory motor skills, we don't see a reason why we should not think of language learning in terms of training, and not learning, exactly like a sport discipline. So let's see how it fits, and let's apply language learning to the sensory motor theory of skill retention. According to this theory, learning starts with a cognitive stage, or they also call it acquisition, which taps only into the declarative part. At this stage, speaking a language requires a lot of effort. We struggle, we mumble, we're searching for words. And then as we practice more and start using language in real situations, the skills, playing piano or language, gradually move into the procedural part. During the phases of consolidation and tuning, here we developed, or we keep developing intuitions, and we learn patterns, and it is here in the procedural or the autonomous stage where language becomes automatic and effortless. So when you look at that, it feels right, doesn't it? Especially when you consider the levels A, B, and C of the Common European Framework of References for Languages. A being the orange, yellow, or B being the yellow, and C being the creamy beige. Now, two crucial facts. Research indicates that activation of our declarative memory system can suppress activation of the non-declarative memory system that is intentionally trying to learn specific information, can get in the way of subconsciously learning patterns and intuitions. That explains why adults have some problems learning languages. On the other hand, children's declarative thinking is not developed well, so the language skills kind of go immediately into the procedural part. This explains why children learn language with such ease. This all suggests that for successful language learning, we should be looking for ways to switch off or at least silence our declarative thinking. And now things like hypnosis, sleep deprivation, physical activity, even walking or listening to music are confirmed to do exactly this. Consuming alcohol is also known to have this effect, which might explain why it is easier to speak a foreign language when drunk. But there is one surprising thing that does this as well. Completing a challenging working memory task that is cognitively tiring silences our declarative thinking. So being cognitively tired opens up the way to developing intuition. Working hard works. Now, the problem with these techniques is that they are not sustainable, they're not practical. Without sleep, we don't learn at all. We are also very lazy, so we don't want to work hard. So instead of doing that, and because we are logical, or we think we are logical, and we like to analyze things, we went into the opposite direction. And here is where it went wrong. Mankind has harnessed all its powers of logical thinking to create a very precise description of what happens in a sentence, like the roles and types of words and how they impact each other. And what we were unable to assign to any rule, we classified as an exception, and we call it grammar. And now we hope to use it to help us produce sentences. It seems so logical that we can combine this logical description with our ability to think logically, to express ourselves in a logical way in a foreign language. But it's like reading a book about boxing strategy. It can improve your strategy, but only if you have trained enough in the gym. You will not learn how to fight by reading books. So what happens for many people around the world is on this picture, taking words and solving logical equations using our mind as a sort of calculator. And we know there is a problem with this approach. Our short-term memory is fast enough to process this, but too small to remember all the rules. And our procedural memory is big, but completely doesn't understand rules. We are learning the wrong things in the wrong way. So how do we practically get to the desired state when we simply know which word follows which without thinking about grammar? Well, there seems to be an alternative. Research suggests that adult brains store not only single words, but also sequences of words of various lengths, the so-called formulaic sequences. These are ready-to-use phrases, idioms, collocations, sentence fragments, or even whole sentences, and they account for 30 to even 70% of the language used. And it's true not only for native language, but also for foreign languages, although the chunks or the formulaic sequences differ. So when you look at it, everything indicates that we start learning a second language from the wrong angle. Regardless of what method of learning we stick to, when it comes to building sentences, sooner or later, we fall into the trap of grammar discussed above. And we know this doesn't work. After all, we know for a fact that people who have practiced the language long enough to speak fluently forget most of the grammar they have studied so carefully. And even if they're able to recall some rules, they certainly don't use them when speaking. Why then do we so passionately try to construct sentences using logic when we are just beginning to take our first steps in a new language, when even recalling words from memory can be a challenge? Isn't there a better way to do it? Well, there seems to be, and you are looking at it. Since we want our brains to remember not only single words, but also their combinations from the very beginning, we need to repeat and memorize those combinations. Take the speakers of bidding actions as an example, whose speed reaches 250 words per minute, double that of normal speech. And to reach that speed, they actually train phrases of different lengths. And according to various estimates, 80 to 90% of what they say is formulaic language. So why not replicate exactly the same method for general language learning? And various tests we conducted at Thalhammer already show that 1,000 words and about 5,000 sentences make it possible to create training material containing about 80% of the most common words and combinations, like phrases, tenses, questions, negations, etc. And actually, when I studied Indonesian using Thalhammer and using this set of sentences, what happened is that I started talking to people before I could understand anything, which is the opposite of what happens with the majority of language students. So how can we remember such a number of elements? We're talking 5,000 to 6,000 elements. And not today, during training with a book or app, but when it really counts, later in a conversation with native speaker. I have two pieces of news, as usual, one good and one bad. The bad one is that it will be hard. It has to be hard. We already know that cognitively tiring tasks silence our declarative memory. But the good news is, on the other hand, is that there are a few simple techniques that practically guarantee success when it comes to long-term memorization. So what exactly do we need to do? The theory that supports long-term learning is called desirable difficulties, a term coined in 1994 by Robert and Elizabeth Björk, who were investigating conditions under which learning is most effective. They are difficulties because they create challenges and can slow us down initially during learning. They are desirable because they enhance our ability to perform later. In other words, introducing difficulties during the learning process can enhance long-term learning, even if they temporarily hinder immediate performance. For language learning, this means it will take time and it will be difficult. And the three most relevant desirable difficulties for our context is spacing, interleaving, and testing via retrieval or generation. Spacing effect is one of the most fascinating effects from across the entire history of experimental research on learning and memory. If done properly, the effect is so strong that you can remember things you learned once, even years after studying, and I'm talking 10 to 15 years. The spacing encourages learners to distribute practice sessions over time rather than cramming information into one single session. So for example, instead of learning a lot today, you should just learn a little bit, and tomorrow also learn a little bit, and then in 2 days, repeat what you learned today, and in 3 days, 4 days, repeat what you will have learned tomorrow, and then gradually increase the interval between repetition. Now, the natural effect of learning in this way is forgetting. You will forget. But it turns out forgetting is desirable. Let's look at the forgetting curve, which models our forgetting. So if we learn something today, the steepest drop in memory will happen very quickly after learning. If you learn 20 words now, within few hours, and that is 5, maybe 10 hours, you will only remember half of them. And in 25 days or so, you will maybe remember 5%, if you are lucky. Magic happens when you recall or repeat a word, especially after some delay. This repetition strengthens the neural connection responsible for that word, which results in flattening the new forgetting curve. And this happens every single time you repeat information. So after 8 repetitions, your chance of remembering increasing from 5% to 85%. Retrieval is a memory modifier. In practical terms, forgetting is best conquered using the well-known space repetition algorithm, which computes the optimal intervals for subsequent repetitions, gradually increasing the time intervals between repetitions. And spacing has been proven to be effective for people with memory disorders such as amnesia or Alzheimer's disease. Now, spacing gives the best effects if it is complemented with the so-called interleaving. And interleaving is the most counterintuitive and surprising desirable difficulties. Interleaving means mixing different categories and alternating our study in terms of skills, topics, etc. It is best explained when contrasting it with a blocking way of learning. So for example, we study first topic 1, which is, for example, present perfect, over and over again until we feel like we have mastered it. And then we move to learning words related to shopping, like fruits. And once we feel we remember them, we move to topic 3, which is, for example, passive voice, etc., etc. Now, an interleaving way of learning means mixing all those categories, like you see on the picture. So now a question: what learning leads to better results long term? Notice that learning via blocking is usually the first choice for many people, simply because it seems to be working well at first. But what you don't realize is that your performance will drop dramatically with time. You see this effect on this picture. As long as you are studying, you are performing better compared to the interleaved way of learning. But if I test you with a delay, your performance will drop. Exactly the opposite happens with the interleaving way of learning. Kind of hinders performance short term, but optimizes it for later when it really matters. And this is what we aim at during language learning. This is proven for vocabulary, mathematics, sports, playing instruments, etc. And if you think about it, such mixed training is more in line with situations in real conversation in a foreign language. We are very unlikely to say sentences over and over again in present perfect in a normal conversation. When learning a language, what you need to do is to mix all possible categories, such as words, chunks, present perfect, colors, passive voice, verb conjugations, short stories, etc., etc., etc. This brings us to testing. Testing is the most misunderstood tool, not only in language learning, but in education. We think of testing much more as evaluating learning progress rather than a part of learning itself. And that's very unfortunate. Experiments show that engaging in testing, and testing here means retrieving from memory and output, rather than excessive restudy and input, like reading explanations or looking at lists of listening, contributes to more robust learning outcomes. That means that it is output and not input that counts. And in many experiments, students who had fewer repetition sessions overall, but those sessions that they did have were devoted to solving tests, achieved significantly better results long term. Even testing without giving the correct answer yields better results than reading the same information several times. Retrieval is memory modifier, remember? As an example, think about how to use a life vest on an airplane. You probably witnessed this demonstration numerous times during boarding. So where is the vest? Okay, under the seat. How do you inflate it? And are you sure you would really know what to do in case of emergency, in a high stress situation? By now you have probably figured out that you pull the string to inflate the vest, but did you remember you need to do it only after leaving the plane? Testing it once would be enough, and there are actually initiatives going on recommending building testing locations on airports where you could not only try the vest, but also do a test to see if you remember what to do and when. But strengthening memories is not all. The more we test ourselves, the more we seem to lower our anxiety when using the skill in real life. And this is crucial for language learning because the fact of using foreign language in a real conversation is extremely stressful by itself and paralyzes many learners. So reducing anxiety is very desirable for language learning. Now, despite all this evidence, most of the popular language learning apps unfortunately fail to deliver exercises that really work. Just as you can find plenty of examples of engaged users on social media, you can also find plenty of people complaining that the apps don't teach them the language. So what is the reason for that? The main reason is that these exercises are just too easy. They reveal too much context up front. For example, matching images with words or arranging words in the correct order, even for nonsensical sentences or sentence pronunciation. All of that presents the learner with a half-solved riddle. The words are already there. As you see in this exercise, there was Signor Francesco saying here, io sono Francesco, piacere, and I had to choose between piacere and sono. In most cases, each of us is able to achieve very good results in such an exercise. This increases user engagement and gives a sense of learning. Unfortunately, this feeling is very illusionary. In a real situation where we will need to use a language, we will not be prompted with words from which we need to build a sentence. It's a little bit like lifting weights. If it's very easy, your muscles will not grow. The repetitions are also not spaced out enough in time. When using one of the popular apps, on the first day, in the first 15 minutes, it asked me to repeat the word apple at least 10 times in different variants of exercises, like matching words with images, writing down or clicking what I heard, or arranging words in order. And then as I progressed, it was testing me predominantly to repeat what I already knew very well. And also multiple times in one session, every day, not giving me enough time in between to forget. And then after a few days, they completely disappeared from the repetition schedule. So it looks like the repetition algorithms are tweaked for user engagement, but not for long-term retention. Not to mention interleaving of categories or chunks. I did not see them at all. So what's going on here? Why are those apps so popular if so much is going wrong? Well, I gave you the first answer before. It gives the learner an illusion that they are making progress without much effort. And this feels good. But there is another reason as well. Gamification. Features like badges, leaderboards, competition with various leagues and rewards. So this combination of easy exercises and gamification makes it addictive. But we might have a problem here. There are more and more studies that show gamification to have negative effects. That was a big surprise for me because I assumed that well-done gamification will always be beneficial to the learning process. But there are studies out there that mention things like lack of effect or worsened performance when compared to non-gamified systems. And it gets worse. Long-term demotivation, loss of self-belief, issues with concentration, addiction, all of that transfers to other areas of life. It also teaches or seems to be teaching unethical behaviors like gaming the system or cheating, doing an exercise only to get a diamond, logging in very briefly just to keep the track, or freezing the track by paying money. What kind of habits are we learning by doing that? This is all, of course, ongoing research, but early results indicate that gamification might not be good after all. I would not be complete without dispelling the last myth, which we believe so strongly that we never consider it being wrong. You might be listening to what I'm talking here and thinking, yeah, well, but what about if I'm an auditory type or I'm visual? So I learn best by listening and I learn best by seeing. So bad news. If you believe in these so-called learning styles, you are actually wrong. What is true is that you might have a preference. This means you might prefer listening or seeing and touching. You might also have a better auditory memory, which can help you, for example, recognizing birds by their bird song. But language learning is more conceptual. It just doesn't work that way. The key here is that your preferences don't actually enhance your learning. So let's imagine if I want to test you on remembering words and I will present those words in different ways, like lists or sounds. So what you would expect is that auditory learners would learn better if they hear the words, and that visual learners would learn better if they see a list of words. But what would actually happen is that you would learn equally well, regardless of the way. And it is very tempting to say or to think, yeah, but it kind of works for me, because this belief is so strong. But the truth is that if you look at research from the last 40 years, there's not a single piece of evidence that supports learning styles. Good moment to wrap up here. We all learn in exactly the same way, via interleave repetition, recall, testing, and then trying it out in real world. Speaking a foreign language can be seen as a skill like any other. Everybody can master any foreign language, although it does become more difficult with age. Of course, there are exceptions. Language has a special status, though, since it is through language that we express our thoughts, and it is through language that other people perceive us and judge us in a certain way. This means that suddenly the most ordinary activity of trying to produce a sentence can become very stressful. Whether we succeed in speaking correctly becomes a test of our intelligence. And yet, despite this, and despite all the progress in technology, the explosion of engaging and interactive content and tons of comprehensible and compelling input, we don't really learn languages any faster than 30 years ago. We seem to ignore the fact that language learning must be difficult, and we fall into the trap of exercises that create an illusion of progress. We believe in shortcuts and ignore the obvious truth that if the way you learn is easy, then most probably will not have a lasting effect on our performance. If we want to change that as a community, we have to spread the news that in order to be successful, we should train languages rather than learn or acquire them. And all good training needs to be exhausting, like boxing or fencing. After a 1-hour session with spaced repetition on good interleaved content, you should feel tired. Input less, output more. This will make it more effective when it really matters in a conversation with native speaker. The very dream of many language learners around the world. And finally, I invite you to try out our app, Talhammer, where we not only addressed all the things discussed in this talk, but we also give you a possibility to insert your own personalized content supported by all kind of AI. If you look at the sponsor section on the Polyglot Gathering platform, you find links there. Thank you. And I hope there are some questions.
Personally, I don't really like flashcards. My dad loves them because they're so efficient, but I personally hate them because, I mean, I don't need it right now because I'm still a kid and I still don't question it a lot. I'm like only 11 years old, but still, I find it really boring sometimes, and it, I mean, is it like somehow possible to make it more fun?
Yes. So so every training should be fun somehow. So I envy you your age, and I envy your passion in learning languages. Your brain works a little bit differently than mine. So maybe you don't need flashcards, but when you're my age, the way of learning languages that you are doing just doesn't work that good anymore. So how I can answer that question. So in your case, hey, enjoy the process, and you are the future of this community. But for the adult learner, I can quote. Yeah, we have a comment here, but you still need to repeat the content, right? We have a question here from Andrea. How do you practice the repetitions concretely? So flashcards, not flashcards, we can call them flashcards, but the idea is, so flashcard is the one implementation of retrieval, right? So the idea is that you have to search through your memory to find the information that you learned before. And flashcard is just the perfect tool for that. You see this in one language, and really you have to dig in your memory to find the translations. And even if you don't find it, and then you reveal the answer, science is saying that this very fact of searching strengthens the memory that's responsible for the information. So flashcards is the way to go. Also with interleaved content. So this is how we do it with Talhammer. We use flashcards, but we combine it with stories. We combine it with verb conjugations. We combine it with very short grammatical references, because we also don't say that grammar is useless. What we say is grammar is not the tool that can help us creating sentences, but it's a perfect tool for referencing. So if you already mastered words and sentences using flashcards, then looking up the grammatical rules and seeing, okay, so this is how it works. My intuition, because your intuition will probably be right. You will be making hypotheses about how it works when you learn a representative number of flashcards. But then look up shortly grammatical rules, look up more examples, and this will solidify even more your memory. So my answer to this question, flashcards with using space repetition and the real space repetition, not the one in the most popular apps in the world. In Talhammer, we actually implemented the forgetting curve using machine learning, and we have good interleave content. So we address in Talhammer everything that I have talked about in this talk.
I've found that at a certain stage in language, that using something like Tandem to find a speaking partner was very helpful. And I think I made much more progress through doing that than any studying.
Yes.
But you needed to get to the level to be able to do that.
Exactly. Yes, that's the. So how I frame it, you need to somehow prepare yourself for that situation, and then searching for put yourself in a situation when you have to actually use the language. But you will not, at least in my experience and all the things that I read, you will not just, magically start speaking. So you have to do all the hard work. It's a little bit like boxing, right? Or like playing basketball. So you learn it, or football. You actually learn while being on the field and playing a real game. That's what speaking is, right? With a partner. But in order to be able to do that, well, you have to do the work before that. You have to learn how to dribble. You have to learn how to shoot, and you have to learn all the little elements, and then go to the real game. And there is where the real magic happens. This is the autonomous stage in the theory of skill retention, is exactly about this, about going out and using the skill in real life. Exactly. You will not wake up one day magically and just start speaking. You need to. We are becoming good at things we do. So if you want to become good in speaking, well, not surprisingly, you need to speak. If you want to become good in reciting list of words, well, then you need to learn list of words, right?
I think the other point I would make is that you mustn't be afraid of speaking like a child, making mistakes. If you're embarrassed, it's a barrier to learning. I have a friend who can read about 15 different languages, Old Church Slavonic and all sorts of things. She has learned 5 times from the beginning Welsh, and she cannot speak Welsh fluently.
Yes, that's
She's a genius.
That's the problem, right? So you one way of framing this is make a fool out of yourself. That's part of the game. Some people say, go out there and make as many mistakes as you only could. There is just no other way. The problem is, and I mentioned that in the talk, is that because we use our language to express our thoughts, it kind of linked to our ego. So we are embarrassed to start using the language because we feel we are less intelligent in that language, and we want to avoid that. But once again, so there is some theories that are saying that apparently some tribes somewhere where people learn languages by waiting for the right moment to speak, and then they magically speak. We should probably look that up, but in my experience, well, it doesn't work. There is so I read a text and question from Chris. I truly believe language acquisition should be inside the cultures. You acquire phrases and words through association. You connect the words and phrases with real life experiences, smell, sounds. Learning outside the culture, let's say, in an online course is not as efficient because there are no associations. So your brain doesn't connect it with any real stuff, which makes it kind of useless. Bingo. There is a book that I think is called, the author is called Daniel Everett. The book is called How Languages Began. If you look Daniel Everett, you will, that's his last book. So he's actually saying that the language is not special. He's saying the language is a tool that evolved in a culture out of a need to communicate. There are other theories saying that learning happens only through, exactly like you are saying, through associating new information with the information that you already have and linking all those kind of experiences, and only then in actual use, being it in a partially in language lessons, because that's also context, that's also speaking, but even more so in real life, it just becomes part of you, right? So I would use this exactly the same analogy as before. You know, your real life, it's the game of football, or your fight in boxing. Go out there and through associating all of that, you will become more and more proficient and more automatic in the language, which is exactly what we are aiming at. So I very much agree, Chris. Language probably doesn't exist outside of human culture. And by the way, I know that language apparently evolved 2 million years ago. Homo erectus most probably had language. It's not Homo sapiens that 200 years ago created language out of a sudden. We inherited it from Homo erectus. Everything in the book by Daniel Everett, how language began, I think. And yeah, our time is up. Thank you very much for your attention and for all the questions. I invite you once again to try out Talhammer. And if you have more questions, please contact me at Viacek@talhammer.com. And yeah, if you have questions or want to have interesting conversation about language learning, please contact me. And I promise you will have this interesting discussion. Thank you very much, and enjoy your break and enjoy the rest of the conference or gathering. Thank you.